Chapter 1 The Last Stand of Earth. The countdown echoed through the cold, sterile air of the command center like a drumbeat of doom. 10 seconds. Ronan Thorne stood in front of the massive viewport, his eyes scanning the sky as the Zerthian fleet loomed ominously, each ship a gleaming harbinger of destruction. They were coming, and Earth had nothing left to stop them. 5 seconds. The voice of General Maya Nash crackled over the comm, sharp with tension. Ronan didn't respond. His eyes never wavered from the distant fleet, his mind racing. "I never thought I'd die like this," Nash muttered under her breath. "Outgunned, outclassed. A relic of the past facing an unstoppable force." The words hit Ronan like a cold wave, but he remained unmoved. He wasn't a man who let the weight of inevitability bend him. He was the inevitability. "Hold your fire." Ronan's voice cut through the unease, calm and steady. He didn't flinch, didn't look back at the team behind him, all their eyes glued to their monitors, hands hovering over their triggers. "We wait. Let them underestimate us." Nash let out a frustrated breath, but didn't argue. They had reached this point not because of superior numbers or technology, but because of humanity's tenacity. No one had believed they could make it this far, not even the humans. The Zerthians, the galaxy's apex predators, had arrived with no intent to negotiate. No offer of peace. Earth's remaining fleet was down to a handful of vessels and one last hope. The cannon. It was an absurd idea, a relic of an ancient war, long abandoned in favor of better, faster, more lethal technologies. But Ronan had studied it, understood it. Its power lay not in its modernity, but in its unpredictability. And now, the fate of humanity rested in the hands of that archaic weapon. 1 second. Nash's voice rang out, tight with an undercurrent of desperation. Ronan's fingers gripped the edge of the control panel. His pulse quickened, but his face remained unreadable. The screen flashed red. The Zerthian fleet was within range. "Fire!" The old artillery cannon, a clunky, unwieldy piece of machinery, shuddered as it released a deafening roar that rattled the entire outpost. The blast arced through space, slow and deliberate, a long curve of energy that seemed almost laughable next to the sleek, deadly ships of the enemy. Ronan's heart raced, but he watched it with a cold, calculated focus. "Direct hit," came the voice of Lieutenant Lau from the targeting station. The screen blinked and showed a Zerthian frigate shuddering, its hull cracking, and then erupting in a fiery explosion. For a moment, there was silence. And then the laughter started. "You've got to be kidding me," Nash whispered, incredulous. Ronan didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the fleet. The enemy's ships didn't seem concerned. They hadn't even begun to maneuver in response. The power of the cannon wasn't enough to deter them, not yet. But the message was clear: humanity had nothing left to lose, and they weren't going to go down quietly. A moment later, the Zerthians retaliated. The sky outside erupted in light as their advanced weaponry fired in unison, a burst of destructive energy that tore across the void. Ronan's jaw clenched as he watched the oncoming assault. The blast came in waves, shaking the entire station. "Shields holding at 27%, a voice shouted from the comms panel. "The rest of the fleet is down. It's us now." Nash swore under her breath, and Ronan felt the weight of her words sink in. The last of Earth's defenders, the last of humanity's hope, rested on an old cannon and the skill of the few who stood ready to fight. There was no more room for doubt. Another blast. The ship's alarm shrieked. Ronan turned to face Nash, his gaze unflinching. "They think we're done," he said. "But they haven't seen what we can really do." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of an unwavering belief. "Prepare the second shot." Nash stared at him, disbelief flashing across her features. "Are you serious?" she demanded, stepping forward. "That cannon's barely holding together. They'll tear us apart before we get another shot off." Ronan didn't flinch. "We don't have a choice." He reached for the controls. There was a moment of stillness, a brief pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then the old artillery creaked to life again. Its long, groaning barrel turned, its ancient systems whirring to life as the countdown began once more. Ronan's hands were steady, his movements precise. Behind him, Nash could only watch. She had seen courage, and she had seen desperation. But there was something else in Ronan's eyes, something that spoke of the countless hours of research, the quiet moments of strategy, the planning. He knew something she didn't. He had a vision that defied the logic of the situation. "Ready," Ronan said. The calm in his voice was unnerving. He pressed the button. The cannon's roar shattered the silence of space again, but this time, something was different. The blast was faster, more precise, an unexpected twist of fate that caught the Xerthians off guard. It hit their flagship head-on, a direct strike that sent shockwaves through their entire fleet. The explosion wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. For the first time in the battle, the Xerthians hesitated. "We did it," Nash said, but there was no joy in her voice. Only shock. Ronan didn't look away. The Xerthians were already regrouping. They weren't beaten. Not yet. "This is just the beginning," he muttered, almost to himself. "We've given them a reason to fear." As the station shuddered again from another incoming attack, Ronan Thorne grinned grimly. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, the Xerthians would think twice before underestimating humanity. And that made all the difference. The shockwaves from the previous blast still reverberated through the station, and though the Xerthians had momentarily faltered, the looming darkness of their fleet was a constant reminder that victory was never certain. Ronan stood at the center of the operations room, watching the monitors flicker to life. His eyes never strayed from the dark expanse of space, where the fleet of the Xerthian Empire continued to edge closer. "We've done the impossible, Ronan," Nash said, her voice heavy with disbelief. She leaned over the console, her fingers flying over the controls. "But this isn't over. They're regrouping." "Not yet," Ronan replied, his voice cool, almost detached. He didn't flinch as another burst of light flashed across the sky outside the viewport, an incoming volley from the enemy. The impact rattled the station, the hum of failing shields filling the room like the distant buzz of a hornet's nest. But Ronan's expression remained unchanged. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Ronan's mind raced. The cannon had made its mark, sure, but it wasn't enough to defeat the Xerthians. Not yet. They were the most advanced species humanity had ever faced, and they wouldn't simply fall back and retreat. They'd learned something in that first strike. Humanity had a weapon that they couldn't predict. And Ronan knew that the Xerthians wouldn't let their pride allow them to repeat that mistake. "What's the status of the fleet?" he asked without looking away from the view. "Nothing left to report," Nash replied. "The rest of our ships are gone. Our fighter squadrons are all but wiped out. We're on our own now." Ronan finally turned to face her. The tension in the room was palpable, but in Nash's eyes, he saw a flicker of something more, fear. For the first time since the Xerthian invasion began, fear was creeping into the seasoned general's gaze. Fear of losing everything. Ronan could feel it too, deep in his gut. "We need another shot," Ronan said, his voice steel. "We need to make it count." The room fell silent. Nash's lips tightened. She glanced over at the targeting officer, Lieutenant Lyle, who was frantically working at his station, a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. Despite his experience, the weight of the situation was beginning to show on him. "The cannon's been severely damaged," Lyle said, his voice strained. "If we fire again without repairs, we risk losing it completely. That shot was pushing it. This thing wasn't built to endure this kind of pressure." Ronan didn't blink. "Then we'll push harder." "We don't have the resources, Ronan," Nash interjected, a sharp edge creeping into her tone. "You're asking for a miracle here. There's nothing left to throw at them." Ronan's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of her words, but there was something deeper at play here. The cannon, this old relic, was humanity's last card, the last ace in the hole. To retreat now, to surrender, was unthinkable. To let the Xerthians win would be a disgrace to every man, woman, and child who had died trying to hold Earth's defense together. The very idea made his skin crawl. "I'm not asking for a miracle," Ronan said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm asking for you to trust me. You know how this works. This is the moment. This is when we prove that they're not going to just walk all over us." Nash hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his words. For all her experience, for all her tactical brilliance, Ronan could see the shadow of doubt growing in her mind. It wasn't that she didn't believe in him, it was that she knew just how dangerous this move could be. "We've lost everything," she murmured, her voice low, barely a whisper. "All of it. What if this is the end? What if we can't make them believe in our strength?" Ronan's eyes softened, though the determination in his chest never wavered. "Then we make them fear us. Fear is the only thing they understand." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their situation. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. "Do it," Nash said finally, her voice steadying. "But you better hope this works. We've only got one shot at this." Ronan gave a single nod, and they moved into action. The tension in the room ratcheted up, every second stretching out like an eternity. The engineers scrambled to repair the cannon, their faces tense, their hands moving with practiced urgency. Ronan stood over them, watching as they worked. Every second counted. Every movement, every repair, was a moment closer to their salvation or annihilation. And then it happened. The cannon roared back to life. It wasn't perfect. The weapon had been battered, and the noise it made as it powered up was more of a guttural growl than the sharp whine of a well-maintained machine. But it was enough. Ronan stepped forward, his fingers brushing the control panel. The hum of the cannon's energy was a growing pulse, resonating through his bones. Nash leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. "Are you sure?" Ronan's gaze flicked to the monitor. The Zerthian fleet was nearly upon them now, the ships as massive and imposing as any he'd ever seen. But something in Ronan had changed since the first blast. He wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had transformed into something more powerful. "I'm sure." He pressed the button. The cannon's roar shook the station to its core, and the sky outside seemed to bend under the force of the blast. A streak of light surged through the darkness of space, faster, more violent than before, and it struck the nearest Zerthian ship with terrifying precision. It exploded into a cloud of debris, the shockwave sending ripples across the space ahead. The second shot had done its job. But as the debris cleared, a horrifying realization dawned on them all. "Something's wrong," Nash said, her voice tight with growing concern. "They've regrouped. They're adapting." And at that moment, the full weight of the Zerthians' power crashed down on them. The fleet's formation shifted, closing in from all sides. "We've provoked a hornet's nest," Ronan muttered, his eyes locked on the unfolding carnage. "Now we've got to make them pay for it." The real battle was just beginning. The Zerthian fleet was relentless. Like a living thing, it pulsed with cold purpose as its ships encircled their station, a swarm of metallic giants closing in with terrifying precision. Each moment stretched out, a slow burn of tension that gnawed at Ronan's resolve. Their weapon systems were offline, most of the remaining fighters had been destroyed, and there was nothing left between them and annihilation except the bloodied remnants of humanity's last stand. Nash stood beside him, her face pale, but her eyes were steady, scanning the incoming ships on the tactical display. "They're not wasting any time," she murmured, her voice low but tight with restrained urgency. "We've pissed them off, Ronan. They're coming in fast." "We know," Ronan replied, his gaze fixed on the screen. His mind raced. Every choice had led them here, and the weight of it all was suffocating. The Zerthians were too many. Too strong. Too ruthless. Humanity had done everything in its power to survive, but now it was simply a matter of whether they could outlast the inevitable. "Can you pull any more tricks from that cannon?" Nash asked, the desperation creeping into her tone. "No," Ronan said, the word of finality. The cannon had already been pushed beyond its limits. To try another shot would destroy it, and they couldn't afford to lose their only weapon. Their last hope. The room grew quiet, the hum of equipment and the occasional crackle of static the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. Ronan's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. Nash was right. They had made the Zerthians angry, and in that moment, it felt like the end of everything they had fought for. If humanity was to survive, it wouldn't be because of a weapon, it would be because of something far more dangerous: sheer will. "Ronan," Nash said again, her voice louder this time, filled with a note of certainty. "You're thinking of something." "What is it?" He glanced at her, a flicker of something passing through his expression. She knew him too well. He could feel the gears turning in his head, shifting, locking into place. He wasn't done yet. "I've got one last card to play," he said quietly, his lips curling into a small but dangerous smile. "But we're going to need every single person on this station to follow my lead." She raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "And you're sure this will work?" "I'm sure it's the only thing that has a chance." Nash hesitated, her gaze flicking from Ronan to the monitors, then back to him. She had no illusions about what they were facing. It would take more than luck and ingenuity to survive this. But for the first time since the battle had begun, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't just desperation. It was something colder, harder. The same look she'd seen in the eyes of soldiers who had faced impossible odds, and won. "All right," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. "What do we do?" Ronan turned to the tactical officer, Lieutenant Lyle, who was still stationed at his console. "How many of their ships are within striking distance?" Lyle's fingers danced over his controls, and for a moment, there was a sharp silence before the reply came. "They're closing in. I've got at least 6 ships within a 500-meter radius." "Perfect," Ronan said, his lips curling into a tight grin. "Prep the station's thrusters. We're going to take the fight to them." "Are you out of your mind?" Nash snapped, but her voice held an edge of disbelief. "You want to ram the station into their fleet? Are you insane?" Ronan didn't flinch. "We can't outrun them. But we can use the station as a weapon. We'll make it look like we're surrendering, but the moment they come close enough, we'll drop the shields and ignite the thrusters. Full burn. It'll create a shockwave. Should disable or even destroy the closest ships." Nash stood still for a moment, as if weighing his words. The idea was mad, reckless even, but it was the only option left. And that was what Ronan was counting on. If they were going to die, it wouldn't be without taking a few of those bastards down with them. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ronan," she muttered under her breath. "It's the only game left." Without another word, she nodded and turned back to Lyle. "Do it. We're going to need every ounce of power this station can muster." Ronan watched as the tactical officer's fingers flew across the control board, his face twisted in concentration. He could feel the hum of the station around him, the tension mounting as they prepared for their last stand. The crew worked in silence, each movement a testament to their will to fight. Ronan checked his own weapons systems, adjusting settings to maximize their effect once the time came. Every last weapon on the station was locked and loaded, though he knew they'd never get the chance to fire them. "There's no turning back now," Nash said, her voice distant but resolute. "Yeah," Ronan agreed, stepping away from the command center. He moved toward the outer airlock, his boots clanking with each step as he approached the nearest crew member. "Everyone get ready. If this works, we'll need every pair of hands to hold off the aftermath. Get to your posts and stay sharp." The crew scattered quickly, the gravity of the plan settling in. There would be no heroics here, just cold, calculating action. They couldn't afford hesitation. The station's thrusters began to hum, and Ronan felt a pulse of adrenaline surge through his veins. This was it. Nash joined him at the command center moments later, her face grim. "Everything's set. Let's do this," Ronan said, his voice firm, his heart beating faster. They were no longer waiting for the enemy to make their move. They were the ones striking first. It was the only way forward. The Zerthian fleet was within range. They had no idea what was coming. As the final countdown began, Ronan took one last look at the stars. Humanity had been brought to the edge, but they weren't finished. Not yet. And as the station shuddered beneath them, Ronan knew something the Zerthians didn't. Humans didn't just fight to survive. They fought to win. The initial blast of the station's thrusters rocked Ronan's body, a jarring sensation that sent his stomach into his throat. Outside the viewport, the black expanse of space twisted as the ship groaned under the force, the station's metal frame creaking and straining. They had launched themselves into the fray, a sudden shift that would either decimate the Zerthian fleet or get them all killed. "Shields down in 5! Nash's voice rang through the comms, tight with urgency. "Everyone brace yourselves!" Ronan gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white, his pulse thumping in his ears. He had seen this strategy in his mind 1,000 times, but now that it was real, the stakes felt heavier. He glanced at the tactical readout, a blur of red and green as the Zerthian ships closed in. They were taking the bait, a promise of humanity's surrender wrapped in the guise of a desperate escape attempt. But they had no idea what they were about to unleash. "Are we clear to execute?" Nash's voice cut through again, a steady force beneath the tension. "Not yet," Ronan muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on the rapidly closing distance. The Zerthians were closing in. It was now or never. The countdown on the display ticked down agonizingly slow. 4, 3, 2, 1. "Now!" Ronan roared. The station's thrusters ignited fully, sending an explosive burst of energy through the ship. It lurched forward with a shocking speed, as if it had just come alive. The sudden movement caused the closest Zerthian ships to pull back, startled at the unexpected acceleration. But Ronan knew better than to believe they would fall for it entirely. "Raise shields!" Nash barked, her voice sharp as ever, her hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. "They're retaliating." Before Ronan could respond, a volley of laser fire pierced the darkness, striking the hull. The ship shuddered violently, sending vibrations through the walls. They were too close. Ronan could feel the heat of the beams searing the air. "Damage report!" Ronan snapped, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Shields at 40% and dropping," Lyle answered, his voice flat, almost detached, though the fear was evident in his eyes. "Hull integrity holding for now. They're not letting up." "Damn it!" Ronan's jaw tightened. He had known the risk of their plan, but now the reality of their situation was hitting hard. The Zerthians wouldn't give them another chance to make a move. The next volley could be the last. "Helm!" Nash shouted, her focus locked on the forward display. "We need to get closer to their fleet. They won't expect it. Don't give them time to regroup." Ronan knew she was right. At this distance, they could outmaneuver them. A sudden shift in trajectory, a sharp, unpredictable angle, would keep the Zerthians guessing. But that meant taking the gamble, throwing themselves even deeper into the enemy's path. "Do it," he said, his voice steady. The ship lurched again, and the whole station veered sharply left. The sudden angle threw Ronan against his restraints, and for a moment, the world around him spun. He heard a cry from across the room, a panicked shout from someone who hadn't been prepared for the sharp movement. But the ship stabilized quickly. "Hold on, people," Ronan muttered, his grip tightening on the console. The tactical display flared to life again. A new set of ships was closing in fast, trying to box them in. They had only moments before they were surrounded on all sides. Suddenly, the lights flickered as the comms scrambled, a burst of static filling the air. Ronan's breath caught in his throat as the familiar voice of Captain Harper crackled through the comm system. "Ronan!" Harper's voice was strained, her voice hoarse, almost lost in the din of chaos. "We're not going to make it. We've lost the secondary relay. The Zerthians, they're overriding our systems. Damn it!" Ronan cursed under his breath. The secondary relay was critical for their communications with the fleet, their last line of defense. Without it, they were cut off. "Get the relay back online!" Nash barked at Lyle, her eyes flickering over the controls in search of any solution. "It's no use," Lyle said, his voice shaking. The Zerthians have already breached the core systems. We've lost contact with the fleet. Ronan's heart sank. They had no backup plan. No reinforcements. No escape. They were alone. Nash turned toward Ronan, her face hard with determination. What now? The question hit him like a slap. Ronan knew they couldn't outlast this assault. They had only moments before the next wave hit. There was one last option, but it was desperate, and it would require every ounce of their remaining strength. Prepare to fire everything we have left, Ronan said, his voice low but resolute. We'll give them one final show. What are you suggesting? Nash asked, a flash of disbelief in her eyes. The Zerthians are overconfident, Ronan said, looking her in the eye. They'll move in close to finish us off, but they'll underestimate the damage we can still do. We'll sacrifice the core systems, divert every last bit of power to the weapons grid, and make one last shot. You're talking about a one-way ticket, Ronan, Nash replied, her voice filled with dark understanding. I'm not talking about surrender, Ronan shot back. We're going down fighting, and we're taking them with us. Nash exhaled sharply, the weight of his words settling over her. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the distant rumble of gunfire and the hum of the failing systems. All right, Nash said finally, her voice steady. Let's make it count. The crew scrambled, working together in a last-ditch effort to convert their power systems. As the enemy's ships drew closer, Ronan stared at the flickering red countdown on the console, his heart hammering in his chest. One shot. One chance. Here we go, Ronan muttered under his breath. And as the last bit of humanity's power surged toward the weapons grid, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. The Zerthian fleet wouldn't know what hit them,